You're standing in the Colosseum, 50,000. Romans are screaming around you. Sand beneath your feet is soaked with blood. A gladiator raises his sword. The crowd roars, and the emperor's thumb decides if you live or die. That's the image we all have of Roman justice. Isn't it the ultimate test? Fight well enough and maybe, just maybe, you walk out alive. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Here's what Hollywood conveniently leaves out. For the vast majority of Rome's condemned, the Colosseum was never an option, the arena that was actually the merciful choice, the quick way out. Because there was another sentence, one that didn't give you the dignity of a crowd, one that didn't give you the mercy of a swift death, one that the Romans themselves called the living death, and it was designed to break you slowly, piece by piece, in absolute darkness until there was nothing left of the person you once were. This is the story of damnatio ad mortale, condemnation to the minds, and once you understand what really happened in those depths, you'll never look at Roman justice the same way again. What I'm about to show you is going to fundamentally change how you see the Roman Empire, because every marble column, every golden coin, every architectural wonder you've ever admired, it was all built on a system of suffering so calculated, so efficient, that it makes the Colosseum look like child's play. Let's descend into the darkness. We need to start by understanding something crucial about Roman society. They didn't think like us at all. When we think prison, we think rehabilitation. The Romans, that concept would have seemed insane to them. Prisons like the infamous Tullanum were just holding cells, temporary spaces before your real punishment began, because Rome wasn't interested in reforming you. Rome was interested in making an example of you. And they had perfected something far more terrifying than execution. They had perfected erasure. The moment a Roman judge pronounced those two words, add metal to the minds, you cease to exist as a human being in the eyes of the law. Your citizenship revoked instantly, your property seized by the state, your marriage dissolved, your children no longer legally yours. You couldn't own anything, inherit anything, or even write a will. The Romans had a specific legal term for you. Damn the condemned. You were reclassified from person to instrument. You became a tool owned by the state, with the same legal rights as a plow or a hammer. The Roman legal scholar Julian wrote that those condemned to the mines lose their liberty and their citizenship by virtue of the punishment itself, even before they arrive at the place of punishment. You were legally dead before you ever saw the mine. So who received this sentence? Common criminals, yes, but also political enemies, prisoners of war, and especially Christians. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Cyprian called it what it was: state-sponsored murder stretched across years. But here's the genius of damnatio ad mortale. It was profitable. The Roman Empire ran on minerals: silver for coins, gold for temples, iron for weapons, lead for aqueducts, marble for monuments. Mining these resources was brutal, dangerous work that killed free laborers rapidly. So Rome solved two problems at once: punishment and production. Spain's silver mines at Rio Tinto, Dacia's gold Mines, Egypt's stone quarries at Mons. Claudian, these weren't just punishment sites, they were the economic engine of the empire, that coin in your purse, probably mined by a condemned prisoner. The marble on the temple cut by someone who'd been erased from society. The empire's glory was quite literally built on the slow death of the forgotten. What you are about to hear next has been deliberately left out of history. The textbooks won't tell you this. If you believe these stories need to be told, hit subscribe now, because what comes next is going to show you the true horror of Rome's forgotten punishment. Your sentencing is over, Admala. Now begins a journey that would be the last time many would ever see the sun. You'd be chained at the neck and ankles, then attached to a line of other condemned prisoners. If sentenced in Rome to the Spanish mines, you were looking at an 800-mile journey on foot. In chains for weeks, the guards didn't care if you kept up. If you fell, you were dragged. If you couldn't be dragged, you were beaten. If you still couldn't move, you were executed on the spot. Entire convoys arrived at mines with 30 to 40% fewer prisoners than they started with. The historian Diodora Siculus described how the newly condemned would arrive at the mines already half dead from the journey, their spirits broken before they'd struck a single blow against the rock. Then you'd arrive, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Sulfur, rotting flesh, human waste, sweat, smoke from oil lamps, a stench so overpowering that new arrivals would vomit immediately. Then you see the workers, hundreds of prisoners barely recognizable as human, skeletal remains from Roman mining sites show shattered vertebrae, deformed bones from malnutrition, lungs coated in silica dust. The Greek geographer Agathias visited the Egyptian gold mines and wrote, those condemned to the mines are worked continuously, both by day and by night. No relaxation is given to the sick, no consideration for the weak. All are compelled by blows to keep working until, overcome by ill treatment, they die in the midst of their torments. These wretches deem their future more dreadful than the present, and they long for death as more desirable than life. You'd work in 10 to 12-hour shifts. In underground mines, you'd descend hundreds of feet into absolute darkness. The only light came from tiny oil lamps that barely illuminated the rock face and filled the toxic air with smoke. Temperature underground could reach 120 degrees. Therefore, combined with humidity, men collapsed from heat exhaustion within hours. You'd be given basic tools, a small pick, hammer, sometimes just your bare hands. Your quota was impossible amounts that required you to work beyond physical capacity, and you'd work chained, always chained, connected to other prisoners, coordinating every movement. The chains served multiple purposes, preventing escape, but also ensuring that if the mine collapsed, which happened constantly, multiple prisoners would die at once. The Romans calculated that the loss of one prisoner was acceptable, but chains were calibrated to ensure group casualties. The air itself was poison, silica dust would coat your lungs. There's a disease called silicosis, where dust literally turns your lungs to stone. You'd start coughing blood within months. Within 2 years, you'd be drowning on dry land. Cave-ins were constant, the Romans used. Fire setting, heating rock faces with fire, then throwing cold water on them to create fractures. This destabilized everything. Entire sections would collapse without warning. When cave-ins happened, the Romans wouldn't mount rescues, they'd just seal off that section and open a new shaft. The collapsed tunnel became a mass grave. Archaeological excavations at Rio Tinto have found human remains still in chains, still holding their tools, buried exactly where they fell 2,000 years ago. The food, 1 meal per day. Diodorus described it as a small portion of bread and even less water, approximately 1,200 to 1,500 calories while performing labor. That burned 4,000 to 5,000 calories. You were being slowly starved while working yourself to death. Prisoners lost 30 to 40% of their body weight in the first 6 months. You'd watch strong men become shadows, watch them collapse, watch them die. The barracks were called a gastula, the same word used for livestock pens. Underground chambers with no ventilation, no sanitation. You'd sleep in chains, packed with dozens of others, lying in filth. Disease spread like wildfire, dysentery, typhus, infections from untreated wounds, no medical care. If you got sick, you worked until you couldn't and then you died. Average survival time, 6 months to 3 years. Very few lasted longer. This was the punishment, this was the point. Maximum labor, maximum suffering, efficient, profitable hell on earth. Who were these people? The Romans kept meticulous records of everything except the damnati. They were erased so completely that we don't even know most of their names, but we have fragments. We know from Christian martyrs about people like Patamiena of Alexandria, condemned to the Egyptian mines. We know about 40 Christian martyrs sent to the Pheno copper mines in Arabia. Bishop Cyprian wrote letters to imprisoned Christians in the mines, trying to offer comfort to people experiencing unimaginable suffering. He wrote, "The world regards you as already dead, but in reality you are more alive than those who condemned you." You can feel the desperation in his words. We have brief mentions in legal documents. A papyrus from Egypt records a man named Serapion, just his name, condemned at Matala for theft. What did he steal? Did he have a family? How long did he survive? We don't know. That's what erasure looks like. But archaeological evidence is telling us more. Excavations have uncovered graffiti scratched into mine shaft walls, messages from prisoners who knew they'd never leave. At Riointo, archaeologists found tally marks scratched into stone. Someone was counting days. One set reaches 237. Before stopping, we don't know if they died or simply gave up counting. At Laurium in Greece, someone carved "Remember us" in Greek, just 2 words. An anonymous plea across 2,000 years. These small acts of resistance, leaving a mark, counting days, carving a message. They're heartbreaking. They couldn't escape, they couldn't fight, but they could make a mark and hope that someday someone would know they existed. And we need to talk about the children. Yes, children. Roman law allowed condemnation of entire families. Wives, children, even infants could be sentenced alongside the accused. Archaeological evidence includes skeletal remains of children as young as 8 to 10, showing the same mining trauma. As adults, a child condemned to this fate, growing up in darkness and chains. Knowing nothing else, these weren't isolated cases, this was systematic. This was Roman justice. Now we come back to the Colosseum, and here's where everything you thought you knew needs recalibration. The arena wasn't an alternative to the mines, it was a completely different system designed for different purposes. Damnatio ad bestias. Condemnation to the beasts was for common criminals. These executions happened during the lunch break of gladiatorial games. Literally intermission, entertainment. Seneca the Younger described attending these. I come home more greedy, more cruel and inhuman, because I have been among human beings. By chance I attended a midday exhibition, expecting fun, but it was pure murder. The men had nothing to protect them, no one ever struck in vain. These weren't fights. There was no chance of victory. Unarmed prisoners would be driven into the arena, where lions, bears, or leopards would be released. Sometimes prisoners were tied to stakes, sometimes dressed in animal skins to excite the beasts. The result was predetermined. The only variable was how long it would take. Death usually came within minutes. A lion's bite, a bear mauling, brutal, public, terrifying and quick. Compare that to the mines, which is worse. The Romans themselves disagreed. Some legal texts suggest damnatio ad bestias was lighter because it was faster. Others suggest being torn apart was more shameful, but these weren't interchangeable punishments. They served different functions. Damnatio ad bestias was spectacle deterrence through public horror. It made an example, but it was expensive. Maintaining exotic animals was costly, and the victim died too quickly to provide economic value. Damnatio ad metalla was industrial, profitable, efficient. It disposed of enemies while extracting labor, but it was hidden far from Rome, where most citizens would never see it. Gladiators, actual trained fighters, were completely separate. Professional combatants who received training, nutrition, medical care, they were valuable investments. Their managers wanted them to win fights and generate profit. A successful gladiator could become famous, could earn money, could potentially buy freedom. Some became so popular they had groupies. This was not the fate of the damnati. There's virtually no evidence of prisoners being promoted from mines to gladiatorial combat. Why would there be a person the mines for even 6 months? Would be malnourished, diseased, broken. They'd make a terrible gladiator. The systems were separate. Condemned to the mines, you died in the mines. Condemned to the beasts, you died in the arena. Later in the empire, as Christianity grew and public executions became controversial, judges started preferring mine sentences over arena deaths. A law from 325 AD suggests that judges should condemn criminals to the mines instead of bloody spectacles, not out of mercy, but because public executions generated sympathy for victims, especially martyred Christians. The mines were better, quieter. The public didn't have to watch. The condemned would just disappear and generate revenue while they died. That tells you everything about Roman priorities. Let's zoom out and look at the scale. the Roman Empire operated. Dozens of major mining operations across its territory, Rionto in Spain, Laurium. In Greece, Dacia gold mines, Mons. Claudianes in Egypt, Sardinian mines. North African operations, estimating total deaths is nearly impossible because of how thoroughly Romans erased them, but conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands condemned in Matala. Over roughly 400 years, some scholars suggest over a million people erased from history, their deaths fueling the empire's economy, and it worked brilliantly from Rome's perspective. Spanish silver mines produced wealth that funded military expansion. Gold from data was so abundant that, when Trajan conquered it in 106 AD, the loots funded massive building projects, Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Market, architectural marvels that still stand, that marble in the Pantheon. Much came from Mons Claudianes, where prisoners died cutting it. Lead pipes that brought water to Rome, extracted from mines where people suffocated. The copper in Roman weapons, mined by people condemned to never touch those tools as free citizens. Every aspect of Roman civilization was built on this foundation of suffering, and the Romans knew it. They weren't ignorant. They made deliberate choices. They calculated economics. They measured productivity. They adjusted sentences based on labor needs. When the empire needed more workers for Spanish mines, conviction rates went up. When new quarries opened in Egypt, more prisoners were sent there. This wasn't accidental. This was managed. Tacitus casually mentions that Emperor Tiberius sent so many people to the mines, it affected Rome's population. He doesn't express horror, he's just noting it as fact. That's how normalized this was. This system was legal, codified in Roman law. Jurists wrote treatises about proper procedures. They debated whether pregnant women should be sentenced immediately or after giving birth. Consensus: wait until birth, then condemn her and send the infant to be raised as a state slave. This was civilization. This was law and order. This was one of history's greatest empires at its height. The monuments remain. The Colosseum still stands, one of the world's most visited sites. People take selfies. They marvel at Roman engineering, but the mines, abandoned holes in the ground, no tourists, no monuments, only occasional skeletal remains that archaeologists uncover, still in chains, still holding their tools. The condemned of Rome died twice, once in the mines and again in history's forgetting. So what are we supposed to do with this information? The temptation is to see ancient Rome as fundamentally different from us, to view this as ancient barbarism. We've evolved beyond to comfort ourselves that we would never be capable of such systematic cruelty, but that's not the right lesson. What made damnatio ad mala possible wasn't ancient barbarism, it was the same thing that makes atrocities possible in any era. Convincing yourself that certain people aren't really people, that they're instruments, tools, resources to be exploited. The Romans didn't see themselves as evil, they saw themselves as civilized, bringing order and law to the world. They built roads, aqueducts, legal systems. They created art and literature. They made undeniable contributions to human civilization, and Yet they built it all on a foundation of people they'd legally declared to be non-persons. That's the real horror, not that Romans were monsters, but that they were people who convinced themselves that their empire, their prosperity, their civilization was worth the cost of countless forgotten lives. When you visit Rome today, when you marvel at the Colosseum or the Pantheon or the Forum, remember that underneath it all is a story of systematic erasure, of lives ground to dust in darkness, of names lost to history, of people who suffered and died so empire could thrive. The crowd in the Colosseum was loud, the roar of 50,000 voices, demanding blood, but the silence in the minds was absolute, and it's that silence, the silence of the erased, the forgotten, the condemned, that should echo loudest across history, because those who don't speak for the silenced repeat the pattern. If you think these are the stories that need to be told, the ones left out of textbooks, the ones that challenge comfortable narratives about history, then hit subscribe, hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to understand that every empire has a cost, and it's always paid by those whose names we never learned. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the monuments that remain, it's about the people who were buried beneath them.